Amar. Amar Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Yosy did Darei. Rabbi Eliezer said to the Rabbi Yosy who lived in his door, because there was another Rabbi Yosy who lived, I believe, much before him. Afuke Rabbi Yosy Hagadol Shayatana. And he said as follows: Loy tesav akarach, you shouldn't relax, don't sit on your legs. Adam afarshus leila hamas nisan, until you could get me pshat in the following Mishnah. Minayin lo'imer shemater ba'ashrasha. How do you know that the carbon omer is mater any plant that already took root? How do we know that that's the level of maturity that a plant has to have, simple growing roots? How do I know that at that point it'll already get the heter of the carbon omer? You'll see, because it says Aviv. It says in the pasuk Aviv. So let's look at the pasuk. The pasuk says V'imsakriv bikurim l'Hashem Aviv koloi ba'ish. Now this pasuk is I believe talking about. I believe it's talking about the Shtei Alechem, but Rashi tells us that the same way the Shtei Alechem is the matir, it teaches us about the halacha of the omer as well. So it says loy seisav. It says aviv. So it says aviv koli, which is what the carbon that you bring has to be completely ripened. Mitzmashma lav mechlal the ika the lav aviv. There must be other produce in the group that's going to receive the heter that's not completely ripened. So you see, even if it grew a shlish, you see, even if it was merely mashrish, all we know is that it might not have been fully ripened, but there's a huge space between fully ripened and merely having taken root. Maybe what it means is that it's mater tfua that grew a third. Elo Amar Shmuel, it says another pasuk, Mehachel Chermesh Bakama. It says Shiva Shavua is Tispar Lacha, Mehachel Chermesh Bakama, from when it's ready to be cut. Mashma, Lav Machlal Dika, the Lav Bar Chermesh, there's also Tvua in the group that were being matir that's not ready to be cut down. Zok to Gemara, Dilma the Lav Bar Chermesh Uloilam Shachas. Okay, so it tells you something even before Hevir Shlish. But just because it's before it was Hevir Shlish, it doesn't mean it's only Hishrish. Maybe it means Shachas, which means it's partially grown. Royal L'machal Behema, but not L'machal Adam. Amar Yitzchak, it also says in the pasuk, Kama. It says Me'achel Chemesh, Bakama. Lav Mechlal, the Lav Bar Kama. It's mashma that there was others that's not even Kama yet. So Gemara, true, but it still doesn't mean hishrish. Dilma the lav bar kamam ulo olam agam. Agam Rashi says is shegidei lema'at lokuv roishai b'tzad ha'ikar. It's grown long enough of a stem that you could at least fold it over, but still that's more than merely hishrish. Elamoravo, it says asher tizra. It says v'chaga kotzer b'kurei maasecha asher tizra b'asodeh. Asher Tizra is telling us Rishas Riya, meaning when it's merely Hishrish. Omer a popular Rava, Yachi Avagav Dla Hishrish Nami. As soon as you plant it, even before it grows roots, maybe that should also receive the Heter Omer. Amalei Sudni, he said Sudni, and we'll see what that is in a moment. Basadach, if it says Basadach, it has to be in the field. In the field means that it's already somewhat connected to the field, meaning it was hishrish. Sydney, Rashi says, Sydney is either it means a lashon of Talmud Chacham Choshaviyit. Sydney, you should know B'Sadiksiv. Why does Sydney stand for Talmud Chacham? So Rashi, Sydney is Soid Hashem Lireyav. That's what it refers to. Or it could be Sydney could mean someone who makes beer. Meloshin suds, Sudni. Meloshin suds, no. Sudni means, so Rashi, Soid Noah, it refers to a beautiful secret is, if you make beer, you become wealthy. And Rashi quotes from Rav Papa, who said he became wealthy because he made beer. He was a beer merchant, and therefore that's where what's it called Molson got it from. They knew that you become wealthy if you make beer. But I think Rav Papa was a microbrewery. But a couple of them he did very well because he made beer, and Rashi says, "Soid no, why? Because you make beer, you become wealthy, and then you can give tzedakah." As Rashi says all the way at the end. But my karle sudna, soid no shema sheres ugemilos chasadim. So just in case everybody wants to go into the beer business, wait till after Pesach. Yeah, okay. You can call it I beer. Okay, Zok to Gemara weiter. We have learned this Mishnah already. The Gemara had referenced it. You are allowed to cut even before the Omer. Beis HaShlachim fields that you have to bring water to in the valleys. Why? Rashi says, Maher, they get ruined very quickly, so you want to harvest them quickly. The rois, or they're generally bad quality, and therefore there's no Isser Ksir that applies to them. Avaloi Goichin, we don't allow him to pile it up as well. You could just cut it and then pile it up later. Anshe Yerichai, the people of Yerichai, Koitzrin Beratzon Chachamim. They made Ksira, and the Chachamim were very happy with that. They didn't have a problem with it. But the Goichin Shaloi Beratzon Chachamim, they went a step further and they piled it up. That was not with the will of the Talmidei Chacham, of the Chacham. They didn't like it, but they didn't stop them either. You're allowed to cut for the shachas of Ma'achal Behema. Even though you're not allowed to cut tfuah, that's only for tfuah that's going to be eaten by people. But if it's only going to be served to a behema, it's not even fully grown, then it would be allowed. That's only if you started to cut it for Ma'achal Behema before it reached the point where it's 1/3 grown. But after it's 1/3 grown, you're not allowed to cut even for a behema. Reb Shimon Omer, Yiktzar v'yachel af mishehevi shlish. We don't care at what stage of growth it's in. If it's for Ma'achal Behema, you would be allowed to take and cut from it even though it was a vishlish. The koitrin mipnei netiyos. You're also allowed to cut because of netiyos. Rashi says two pshatim, either shelo yifsedu, they shouldn't get ruined. The tfuah was not. If you had tfuah that wasn't. Sorry, if you have bad tfuah that's not really loimer, you're allowed to cut. Why? Because it says ein meviin loimi beis hashlochen v'loimi sadilan. It would not bring the carbon oimer from produce of a beis hashlochen because it was substandard tfuah, as Rashi mentioned a moment ago. From Mim Bishmaitin, we're going to bring a pasuk in the Gemara shortly that tells us if it's from a place that you're not going to bring the Eimer from, you'd be allowed to cut. What happens if there's Klayim growing there? So then you're allowed to cut this wheat down to avoid Klayim. Someone could plant tfuah, and there wouldn't be any other plants there, like vegetables or something. And then some wild vegetable grew. You don't want it to become klayim, so you can cut down the tfuah. Okay, gavaltik. So that's mipnei nitiyos. Mipnei beis ha'avel. If you need it for a beis ha'avel, you needed more room. Rashi says she'ein lahem mokim panu leishev berachva. Levorich birchas rachva keda amar prepare kamedik subis. They made a special bracha, and there wasn't enough room for them to sit. Then you're allowed to cut to make a clearing. But the bittul besmedrash, the same thing. There wasn't enough room in the besmedrash. They needed an extra seating area, so you're allowed to use it. You're allowed to cut the wheat to have a stickle clearing. Gavaltik. Lo yasa oisan krichois. If they have to cut due to one of these reasons, they shouldn't bundle up the tefillah. They just have to cut in order to accomplish what they need. So you're not allowed to make it into bundle. They had a field and they needed to clear it. No, they didn't cut in the Beis Hamikdash. They cut it. They cut the wheat from what?
Their learning was out. They were sitting out.
Yeah, that's right. But they could just leave them loose. Mitzvah oimer lovay mina kemach. The mitzvah oimer mina kama. I'm sorry. They have to bring from wheat that's standing. In other words, they have to specially cut down the wheat specifically for the purpose of the oimer. Loy matzah. What if they didn't find any wheat that was still growing? Yovi min amarim. They're allowed to take from cut down stalks. Mitzvah soilavim in Allah. They're supposed to ideally take fresh, moist grain. Loy matzah. Then you have a yavesh. If you can't find, you bring yavesh. Mitzvah elixir balaylo. The minig is the mitzvah is to cut it by night, the night after the first day Yom Tov, before the first day Chalamoid. Niksa b'yayim kosher, but if it was cut b'yayim, it would still be kosher. V'doiches Shabbos, and it would be doiches Shabbos. Tanu Rabbi Yomimer. Kosav echadomer uktzartim es ketzira ba'avesem esaymer. You should cut and then bring it for the carbon. Uchsiv reishus k'tzirchem elakoyin. So it's a steer up because the first pasuk is mashma that you're allowed to cut from the wheat before the carbon, and the second pasuk is mashma that you're not allowed to cut wheat at all, and the first cutting has to be for the carbon. Okay, Tzad. Mimokim shatamevi iyata koitzer. Mimokim zozak gemara. Mimokim shatamevi ata koitzer. From the pasuk iyata koitzer, from the place that you're going to be cutting for the oimer, that you're not allowed to cut before the carbon oimer. But mimokim shiata maybe. But if it's from a place that you're not going to bring the oimer from, ata koitzer, you're allowed to cut. So what we learn from there is if it's shvachere produce, like a beis hashlochen, you're not going to bring the oimer from there, you're allowed to cut even before the carbon oimer. Fragt Gemara, who said that's what you learn? Ema mimin shata mevi yata koitzer. So the carbon oimer is being brought from barley. So maybe the prohibition is just to cut barley before the carbon oimer. But mimin shiata mevi. But let's say from wheat, at the koitzer, you would be allowed to cut before the carbon oimer. So Gemara, ahulai matzas amrit midrab yochanan. You couldn't possibly say that because of what we learned yesterday in the name of Rabbi Yochanan. And Rabbi Yochanan taught us that Rashi Damer Le'il Aser Reishis Michala. We learn Reishis Michala, meaning that what's Aser? All the grains that you make, that you're mechuyev to separate challah from a dove, that type of grain, would also be covered by the prohibition of chadash. And we know those 5 grains, from which 5 grains you're allowed to make matzah out of. And that's how we know that the Isur Chodosh applies to all 5 grains. So therefore you don't say mimin shi'iyat mevi'at koitzer. Rather you say from shvacher or tfua that I wouldn't take wheat from to make the carbon oimer, that tfua you're allowed to cut before the oimer. Anchi yerichai koitrin baratzon chachamim v'goitrin shaloi baratzon chachamim. Zog to Gemara, man shamis lei. Who is the one who said that me'ikar adin, you'd be allowed to take, but the chachamim were moicha legabe gedisha, but not moicha legabe the ketzira. Zok Gemara Rabbi Yehuda. So Rashi says, what does it mean micha v'lo micha? So the Chachamim were not moicha about the ktsira, but they were moicha about the grisha. Who is the one who says this? Zok to Gemara. The Tana of this Mishnah is Rabbi Yehuda. Freit Gemara, but the problem is the Savar Rabbi Yehuda ktsira the anshi yerichai beratzon Chachamim avoy. Our Mishnah also says that the Chachamim were maskim. It was beratzon Chachamim that they did the ktsira that the Anshe Yericha did the Ksira for these reasons, like for the Mr. Shlochen. The problem is, Vatanya, we learned that Rabbi Yehuda held that they wouldn't have been allowed even to cut. Where do you see Rabbi Yehuda hold you wouldn't have been allowed even to cut? Because it says Shisha Dvarim also Anshe Yericha. There were 6 things that the Anshe Yericha used to do. Shloisha beratzon chachamim v'shloisha shaloi beratzon chachamim. Now we know Yeshua made a terrible gzeira on anybody who would rebuild Yericha. Right? The fellow who rebuilt Yericha lost all his children. He said that when they start building the city, you'll lose your first child. And as you're finishing up building the city, you're going to lose your last child. And that's not what happened. There was an issue only to rebuild Yericha. But once it's rebuilt by a goy, if it was rebuilt, to live in there wasn't a problem. Yidden always lived in Yericha. So there was a community in Yericha, and they did 6 things. 3 of them were Baratzon Chachamim, and 3 of them was Shaloi Baratzon Chachamim. Ve'elisha Baratzon Chachamim. The following list are things that they did in Yericha that was accepted by the Chachamim. One is Markivin, the Kolim Kolayim. They allowed grafting of the Kolim all of Erev Pesach. So even though our minhag would be not to do malach on Erev Pesach, they allowed the Hakava of the Kolim a whole day. They felt that it wasn't much of a malacha. The Karchan Shema, and we'll get to what the Karchan Shema is soon. The Kaichun Lefnei Omer, and they also would cut before the Omer Beratzon Chachamim. That sounds like it's like our Mishnah. Ve'elu Shaloi Beratzon Chachamim, and what are the 3 things they did that was not in agreement with the Chachamim? Goichin Lefnei Omer, they would make Kedisha Lefnei Omer, that they're not allowed to do, like our Mishnah says as well. Umatirin Gamziyoi Shal Hektish, Shel Chruva Shal Shikma. Their parents donated these big, strong trees of Charuv and Shikma to the Beis Hamikdash, and they held that they were only makdish them for their wood, for their trunks that they would cut down. But the leaves that grew, the branches that grew post their being makdish them, that wouldn't be hektish. So if the leaves fell off the tree, those leaves were not hektish. That's another thing that they did, that the Chachamim were not in agreement with them. And Uparchin Pirtois Beginai Sayin Upardois Sayin Lahachil Nesher Lalnim Bishnei Bitsurais Bishabosis Ubiyom Tovim. What they did was they allowed Aniyim to enter their fields to pick from pears that naturally fell off their trees. What's wrong with that? They even let them do this on Shabbos and Yom Tov, and they weren't concerned that maybe if the Ani would take from pears that fell off the tree, maybe the Ani would actually tear pears off a tree on Shabbos, and would be Mechal Shabbos. They let the Aniyim go in, even though Beslan wasn't so happy with it. But that's Divrei Reb Meir. Amar la Rabbi Yehuda said, Im berotzen chachamim menoisen, yehu kol adam moisen kain. If the 3 first items, which are tzira, makivun de kolim, and karchan Shema, so why did only Anshe Yericha do it? If the chachamim were happy with it, well then everyone should have done it as well. Elo elu ve'elu shaloi berotzen chachamim. All 6 things were done shaloi b'ratzon chachamim, meaning even the ktsira sa'omer was shaloi b'ratzon chachamim. So how could you say that our Mishnah is Rabbi Yehuda, who holds that you're allowed to do the ktsira? You see clearly Rabbi Yehuda held that the ktsira, even the ktsira was shaloi b'ratzon chachamim. Val shloisha micha b'yadam, val shloisha lo micha b'yadam. They were all shaloi b'ratzon chachamim, except 3 of them they decided not to be moicha, and 3 of them they were moicha. But the first 3 were not either b'ratzon chachamim, and that wouldn't be consistent with our Mishnah. The Elu Shaloi Micha B'Yadon, Makivin the Kolim, Kolayoim, the Karchan Shema, the Koichin, the Goichin, Lefnei Omer. The Elu Shemicha B'Yadon, and the 3 things that the people of Yericha did, that the Olam was, that the Chachamim were moicha on, are the following: are Matirin Gamzu Yashal Hektish, Shalchur V'Shal Shikma, Upartin Pirtois Beginoisem Aparnisem Kadei Lahachel Neshelanim Bishnei Bitzuris Beshabos B'Yom Tovim, and the 3rd item was Venoistin Peya Layerek. They left Peya even the vegetables. What's the problem if they're leaving Peya Laniyim? The teretz is if they're leaving it payah, that means they're making it hefker. If they're making it hefker, they're being mafsed trumas and maestras, because we know hefker is not muchliv in trumas and maestras. Well, I'm sorry. So you're right. So that'll be number 7. Oh, so according to the way you're reading it, Rabbi Yehuda said there were 7 things, not 6 things. Ella samimi kansira. You take out ksira. So therefore, the whole kasha was that Rabbi Yehuda held that ksira they did shaloi b'ratz chachamim. Take out ksira. Ksira was b'ratz chachamim, and that's why there's only 6. Oh, you picked up on it right away. Gavalti. So what is this thing called korchen ashema? So let's see what Rashi says over here. Rashi says by Karchan Hashema, Umafarish bepsochim b'mokim shenahagu, so yo'ayim Shema Yisrael v'lohoyu mafsikin litin rebach ben teva l'teva. They didn't leave space. What does that mean? So there are those who learn it means they said Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad, and Rashi in Psochim says, and right away you went to V'ahavta Hashem Elokecha. So Frekha Moshe Feinstein, they didn't say Baruch Shem Kavod Malchusay Loylam Vod. Everybody held that you said Baruch Shem Kavod Malchusay Loylam Vod. It's part of the Kriya Shema. So Dr. Moshe, that the Rashi in Psochim has a Tohu Sofer. The Rashi in Psochim has a Tohu Sofer, and it should say between Shema and Baruch Shem Kavod Malchusay Loylam Vod, because Avada, that's part of the Kriya Shema. So if you look at Tosfos says the Yesh Mishomer Shalayim Afsikin Bein Echad LeBaruch. So that's probably Rashi. Dr. Moshe quotes this. So he says, "Weiter is that the real Rashi, and the Rashi in Psochim there must have been a girsa problem." Rav Moshe is able to say that, and that Avada means Baruch Shem Kavod Malchusay. Okay, so more weiter. What? There are others who learn that. Yeah, they said it fast, but there's other sheets and what korchen means. I think what I think there's a pshat is that he doesn't pause in between words at all. There was another pshat. There's another pshat, but I forgot what it was. Okay, Zok Gemara weiter. Koitzer lashachas umaychel lebehema. You cut it l'shachas and you can serve it to a behema. Tanan Osam, we learned in the Mishnah. Ve'elu mafsikin lepeya. The following types of land would be mafsik lepeya. If you have a big field, you only have to leave over one little edge for peya. What if you have 2 fields? You have to leave an edge from each field. So what hefsek would there be in one field between 2 areas that we would consider it 2 fields that would now be mechayiv you a second peah? Hanachal, a river. Vashachlulis is like a big puddle, Rashi is, or like a ditch that was mafsik from the property. V'derech hayachid, which Rashi says is 4 amos, a path that's 4 amos wide. V'derech harabim we know is 16 amos wide. Ushvil harabim, the path of a rabbim, which is narrower, and ushvil hayachid, which is even narrower, hakavua, b'yimoshacham b'yimoshach shamim. There has to be a permanent path that would even be there b'yimoshacham and b'yimoshach shamim. The bor is a field that was left fallow. That would be a hefsek between 2 fields. Near means it's a plowed field, but again not planted. Or v'zera acher, if there is something else planted in that space. So if you have a field that you split into 3, and the center is a product that's not similar to the one on either side, we would treat it like 3 separate fields. V'koitzer l'shachas, and if you cut for a behema when it was not grown properly, that would be mafsik divrei meir. Now the Gemara is going to say that the reason why koitzer l'shachas is a hefsik is because it's not called harvesting. If it was a real harvest, so the whole thing was wheat, let's say, and it was a regular harvest, but you're cutting it in stages, that would not be mafsik in between the fields because it just means you started harvesting from there instead of from there. But kochel shachas is not called ktsira at all. And since it's not called ktsira at all, therefore we look at it like it was fallow or there was something else there, and therefore it would be mafsik divrei Reb Meir. So the Gemara is shortly going to understand that that is pshat Reb Meir. Whether or not it's considered a ktsira, it has a din of a ktsira, legabe answering it before the carbon omer, that would also determine if you would be allowed to do it. Divrei Reb Meir. So Reb Meir holds. So the Gemara is going to assume that if Reb Meir holds that koicher l'shachas is mafsik, he's also going to hold that it's mutter to be koicher l'shachas before the omer. The chachamim ain't mafsik. It's not mafsik. Ella imkein charash. Only if after you cut it l'shachas, you plowed it over. So that's being mafsik. But if you didn't plow it over, we consider it the proper katsira, and therefore, just like you decided to harvest part of the field first, that doesn't make it ois field. Amar Rabba bar bar Chana, Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Reb Meir b'shitas Reb Shimon Amar. Reb Meir has said his halacha. Reb Meir, who said his halacha that koicher l'shachas is mafsik, is going according to his Rebbe Reb Shimon. What did Reb Shimon say? If we turn on to Amud Aleph, we'll see that Reb Shimon in our Mishnah holds that you could be koicher l'shachas even if it was a via shlish, right? The Tanakama said that if you started before it was a via shlish. It says in the pasuk, it says in the Mishnah, Amar Rabbi Yehuda Emosai Bizman Shemaschel Ad Shelo Hivi Shlish. So Rabbi Yehuda is explaining the Tanakama. When can you cut shachas ma'achal lebehema? That's before Hivi Shlish. But after Hivi Shlish, you would not be able to cut it lebehema. It would be considered a tzira asura. But Rabbi Shimon Omer yikshe v'yachal af mishevi shlish. So Zok the Gemara, Rabbi Meir must hold like Rabbi Shimon, his Rebbe, who holds that whenever you cut shachas, it's not called making a tzira, and therefore it would be considered a hefsek in the field. Zok the Gemara, Rabbi Meir b'shitas is Rebbe Rabbi Shimon, the Omar yiktzar v'yachil af mishaviyah shlish. Alma kasover, you see that he holds kol l'shachas, if you're cutting it l'shachas, lav katzirihi, and therefore by definition, the area that you cut the shachas is going to be mafsik because it's not considered part of the rest of the field. Yosef Rabba v'ka'amar lo la shmaitza. Rabba said over this halacha that Rabba bar Chana said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan that our Rab Meir holds like Rab Shimon in the Mishnah, and he asked the following kasha: Ach l'chagav, what if no one cut down this patch of land, rather it was eaten by a chagav or karsamu in the molim? What's the difference of achla and karsamu? Achla means they ate it from the top down. Karsamu means they ate it from the bottom up. So they collapsed the tvua from the bottom. So the halach is, or shavar sayu haruach, or if it was broken by the ruach, meaning no human intervention was involved here. The field sort of got cut down on its own. Hakoil moidim, everybody is moide. Davka charash mafsik, loy charash einay mafsik. That's considered part of the field, and unless you plot over that area, it would be considered one big field. Zaktamur hakol moidim man. What do you mean? What do you mean? Everyone agrees. Reb Meir. It must be Reb Meir. Why? Because let's look at the earlier brisa. Ve'elam afsikin lepeya, and it said Reb Meir holds it's mafsik, and the Chum hold ain't mafsik. And then it says hakol moidim that it's not mafsik if it was achla chagav karsumu namolim. Everybody holds that it's not mafsik. So Pasha means even Reb Meir, who normally holds mafsik, would hold that this is not mafsik. If you're going to learn that the Mishnah that says that it's not a problem, it's not called a tzira, only when it was v'loy v'yishlish, and Brisa the charash and loy charash loy, and the Brisa that says that if it was achla chagovim or karsamud novolim, is not a hefsik, only if they plowed it over. So then I could say b'shehevi shlish. Why is that not called a ksira? Why is it not called a ktira? Because it was havishlish. Then it would make sense. But if you're going to say that our Mishnah is speaking, that not our Mishnah, that the Mishnah is speaking even b'shehevi shlish, hashta uma hosam the ktira, where it's a ksira of a person. Rab Meir lo yishma ksira. Rab Meir said it's not a ksira. If you're cutting l'shachas, it's not called a ksira. Even if it was a via shlish, hacha like kolshikein. Surely over here, by the chagav, where it wasn't even cut by a person, surely it should not be a ksira, and it shouldn't need charisha. So you have to say that Rab Meir holds. You have to say there are males that if it was a via shlish, their Rab Meir would be moida. That would be considered a ksira. But if that's the case, then Rab Meir cannot hold like Rab Shimon in our Mishnah, because Rab Shimon in our Mishnah says even if it's a via shlish, it's not called a ksira. Ella, we're forced to say that Rab Meir does not agree with Rab Shimon. Ella Rab Meir b'shidas Rab Yehuda Amra. You'd have to say that Rav Meir was going according to Rav Yehuda in our Mishnah, who said clearly, Emasai bisman shevi shlish. And therefore, you can make the distinction that where did Rav Meir say that if you cut it l'shachas, it's not considered a ksira, that's if it was lo yuviu shlish. But the Mishnah that talks about the grasshoppers cutting it, that is considered a ksira, that must be speaking kishahevi shlish. So Zok Gemara, emisman bisman b'shidas Rabbi Yehuda Amar emisman bisman shehischil ad shelo hevi shlish. When did your mayor say that it's not a ksira? That's only if the ksira occurred before it was hevi shlish. Aval am hischil ad shehevi shlish, then Reb Meir would be moed it's osir. Zok to Gemara, that's going to be a problem. Why? Because Eimer de Shamas Lele Rabbi Yehuda libehema. Look at the Mishnah. The Mishnah clearly says, what was he cutting it for? He was cutting it for a behema. If you look at the Mishnah, it says, Michael a behema. So our Mishnah says that Rabbi Yehuda holds because you're cutting it not for the purposes of eating it, you're cutting it for a behema. That's where Rabbi Yehuda would have said that you're allowed to cut it kodim shehevi shlish. But Rabbi Meir in our Mishnah, or in the Mishnah of the Machlokes Rameir and the Chachamim, it simply says ve'elam aftikin lepeya, and one of them is the koitzer l'shachas, even if it's not lebehema, just cutting it earlier, but even l'adam. So, Frank the Gemara, if that's the case, Eimer Dishamas Rabbi Yehuda is lebehema. He just said that if you cut it lebehema, that's going to be something that's not considered a proper ksira, and therefore you could do it before the Eimer. But la'adam mishamas lei, and Reb Meir says even if you're cutting it la'adam, kodim shahevi shlish, it's not going to be a good ksira. So what's the problem with that? Because the imkein havalu tlasa tanoi. The kum techois, there's going to be three shitas, because what's going to be? You have the if you're going to say that Meir holds like Rabbi Yehuda, so in fact what you're saying is the Chachamim hold. Where's Rabbi Yehuda? Our Mishnah is the Chachamim hold kocher l'shachas dafka for Michael behema. And Rabbi Yehuda, who we want to say agrees with our Reb Meir, who says even if you cut it la'odam, it's still not going to be a ksira. So you have to Rabbi Yehuda emusay bizman shemas klash levi shlish. But even if you're cutting it for a person, so what's wrong? So say Rabbi Yehuda is arguing on the Tanakama and say there's three shitas. The Tanakama holds kocher l'shachas only Michael behema. Rabbi Yehuda holds dafka achal hevi shlish and even for Michael Adam. And Rabbi Shimon says Yiksev for Rachel Beima after Shevi Shlish. Why are going to be three shitas? The Teretz Rashi tells us is that we know in Shas, whenever Rabbi Yehuda says Amosai, he's not arguing with the Tanakama. He's merely clarifying the Tanakama. So from our mission, it's clear that there's only two shitas, because Rabbi Yehuda agrees with the Tanakama. But if you want to learn that Rabbi Meir said his shita according to Rabbi Yehuda, and we know Rabbi Meir held, even if you were cutting it for the purposes of a person, that's also going to be mutter. it's forcing us to say that Rabbi Yehuda is a third shita, and that's not how we could normally learn pshat in Rabbi Yehuda. Because if you look at Rashi, Rashi speaks out that whenever Rabbi Yehuda clarifies something, it's as follows. It says as follows: if Rabbi Yehuda says "Emosai bisman sheschol," then he's arguing. But if he says, what's our lashon of Rabbi Yehuda? Our lashon of Rabbi Yehuda was, oh, Amos. No, Amos, I mean, he's not arguing. When is he arguing? What does Rabbi Yehuda use the words? What words does he use if he's arguing? That means he's arguing. Here he says Amosai, meaning that he's not arguing. But if you're going to learn like a heel like a mayor, you're going to have to say that he's arguing on the Tanakama. Then can have Lutlasa tonight. Elo Kiyoser Avdimi Omar Rabbi Meir B'Shidish Rabbi Kiva Rabbi Omar. Rabbi Meir is not going according to the Rabbi Yehuda of our Mishnah. He's not going according to Rabbi Shimon of our Mishnah. He's going according to Rabbi Kiva's Rebbe, who's a third shita. That he said what? Amar. He said, let's look at Aleph. The af la'adam nami lo yav. It's Rabbi Kiva who said that even if you cut down wheat, not for the purpose of a behemoth, but for a person, even that's not called a ksira if it's l'shachas. Titnan, we learned hamanamer soda. If you cut the field like a leopard, meaning in spots, some miscellaneous spots, v'shayir boy kalochem lachem, and you left over some moist fuah. Rabbi Kiva merpeya l'chol echad ve'echad. Rabbi Kiva held that each little section that you cut is not called a ktsira, and therefore all the little patches that you left over would be like an independent field that would require its own payah. No, it's one big field. So you see clearly that even if you cut something down early, even for the purposes of a person, it's not considered a ktsira, and therefore all the remaining patches are standalone fields. The only time Rabbi Yehuda says that, the only time Rabbi Kiva says that it's not considered ktsira if you're cutting it to eat right away, Rashi says, "Then you domi the shaka shloivi shlish sekatru l'adam the kliyas l'adam ninu." V'afilu Rabbi Kiva lo have ktsira, but if you cut it l'oitzer, meaning shabishel kol tzarchay. So clear means you cut it down when it was premature. But if it was already fully matured and then you cut it, that even he would agree is considered a proper ktsira, and it would be one big field. I, we have a braisa that says Rabbi Kiva was mechayiv individual payos, even if it was fully ripened and ready to go when you cut it down in patches. So you could say Rabbi Meir holds like Rabbi Kiva that even if you cut it l'odom, it's considered to be not a tzira. Therefore, it will be. And therefore it makes it into a separate field. But he disagrees with the halacha of the oitzer would be the same halacha. Rather, the oitzer would not be the same halacha, and there could be a machlokes about what the halacha is by the oitzer. Okay, we'll stop here. We'll be mamshach tomorrow.